This course focuses on using Photoshop's vector tools to make technical drawings. We will be looking at masking, another key capability of Photoshop, shortly. But as we will see, masks for shape layers depend on bitmaps and Photoshop's bitmap tools. So before we look at masks, we will look at some of the bitmap tools. Photoshop started as a bitmap editor and has a rich selection of bitmap tools that are really aimed at photographers. After all, digital images are bitmaps, and graphic artists for painterly tasks. We are going to look at the basics of just a few of these tools that are useful for masks in technical drawings. The shape tool, but for bitmaps, not vectors, the pencil, and the selection tools. Now, just to be clear, unless you want some painterly features in your drawings, you should stick to vector tools for your shapes and reserve bitmaps for masks on shape layers. We'll start with a new drawing and name it Bitmap 1 and add a layer to it. On layer 1, we want to add a rounded rectangle, but not a vector-based one. The Shape tool has a number of modes of operation. We've been using the Shape mode up to this point, which means the tool makes vector-based shapes. We can change it to make bitmap-based shapes by changing its mode to pixels. Also, for what we are going to be doing here, we want the blend mode to be normal, with 100% opacity and a 10-pixel radius. For bitmap shapes, colors are selected from a small two-color palette near the bottom of the left-hand toolbar. A bitmap will paint pixels with the color in the upper left-hand square. The bent two-headed arrow is used to swap the squares. You can only use shades of gray, black and white are shades of gray by the way, with masks. The little palette icon to the left of the bent arrow resets the two-color palette to black and white. Now we are set to draw something. Make sure that layer 1 and the rounded rectangle tool is selected and use the cursor to drag out a rectangle. Now we have a black rounded corner rectangle on the canvas, but notice that it looks like it only has a fill and no stroke. The bitmap shapes don't really have fills and strokes. Those terms are reserved for vector shapes. The bitmap tools just edit the color of pixels on a layer, some one at a time, or in bulk as we have done here. In fact, at this point, Photoshop has no idea that there is a rounded corner rectangle on the layer. It just keeps track of the color of each pixel on the layer and has no idea that one pixel might be related to another. Now drag out another rectangle. Don't overlap the one that's there. Notice that it was drawn on the same layer as the first. Bitmap tools don't have a concept of path operation like vector tools do. They are just editing a layer full of pixels, and there is no mode that automatically creates a new layer when a new bitmap shape is added. If these were vector rectangles, I would be able to use the Move tool to pick one up and move it. But if I click on the Move tool, a bounding box is drawn around both rectangles, and if I try to move the big one, they both move. Photoshop doesn't know that the rectangles are separate objects, but it does know which pixels are transparent and which are not. Notice that the background of the thumbnail for this layer is a checkerboard, which means that the layer itself is transparent. If you hide the background layer, it'll be obvious which pixels on layer 1 are transparent and which are not. But when you are editing, it is usually easier to have a white background, so turn the background layer back on. The Move tool will put a bounding box around all the pixels that are not transparent on a layer and let you move them as a group. However, you can see two different rectangles just by looking at the drawing. The Selection tool, which as we will soon see comes in many forms, allows you to restrict the operation of the bitmap tools to just the parts of the layers you specify. We'll start with the Lasso tool, which lets you freehand a selection boundary. The selection tools are in two icons in the toolbar on the left, just below the Move tool. Hold the mouse button down on the third from the top icon and a list will fly out. Choose the Lasso tool from it, then freehand a selection boundary around the big rectangle. You need not be accurate, just don't include any of the small rectangle. The boundary you see, which is sometimes called the marching ants because of the way the dashed line is animated, is not part of any layer. It just tells Photoshop to not let any bitmap tools change any pixels outside the boundary on any layer. Now you can use the Move tool to move the big rectangle independent of the small one. The operation of the Move tool is restricted to just the pixels inside of the selection boundary you have drawn. In fact, when you try to move the big rectangle, notice that the selection boundary shrunk down to the edge of the black rectangle itself. That's because Photoshop, in effect, threw away all the transparent pixels from your selection. It does that because you can't move transparent pixels. In fact, one of the primary skills for photographers who use Photoshop is selecting exactly the pixels they want to process in an image. One of the toughest to select is a model's windblown hair, even if the background is quite simple. Fortunately, technical drawings don't often include wind-blown hair. That's why we're only going to look at some of the basic selection techniques Photoshop provides. Back to drawing. Now that we have moved the big rectangle, our selection has been reduced to the boundary for the big rectangle itself. But it's kind of hard to see the marching ants with that bounding box in the way. You can toggle the bounding box on and off with Ctrl-H. However, that toggles the marching ants on and off too. Toggle the bounding box back on, and with the Move tool selected, click on the outside of the rectangles. That removes the bounding box and lets you clearly see the ants march right along the edge of the rectangle, even along the rounded corners. The marching ants limit the operation of bitmap tools to the area inside of them on all layers. So create a new layer. Then on that layer, drag out another black rectangle that more than covers all of the marching ants. It looks like you didn't draw anything at all. That's because the pixels outside the marching ants were not changed. You can see this more clearly by hiding layer 1. When you do that, you see on layer 2 a black rounded corner rectangle that just fills the marching ants. Pull down the application menu, select, and choose deselect. This removes any existing selection and enables bitmap tools over the entire layer. There are other ways to do selections. One of them is called the magic wand. You click on some pixels and it selects them, then extends the selection until it finds pixels that it thinks are different from the ones you clicked on. The magic wand tool is on the toolbar on the left. Hold the mouse down on the icon below the lasso tool and the flyout will show you a selection of tools. Pick the magic wand. Hide layer 2 and make layer 1 visible again and selected. Then click on the big black rectangle. And like magic, all the pixels in the big black rectangle are selected, but none in the small one. Selections do not have to be contiguous. You can use the magic wand tool to add to a selection. The icons on the left end of the magic wand toolbar make a completely new selection, add to what is already selected, remove from what is currently selected, and select only those parts of what is already selected that overlap with what is newly selected. So let's add the small rectangle to our selection. Make sure that Add to Selection is selected. Then click on the small rectangle. Notice now that there are 2 lines of marching ants. Now hide layer 1 and layer 2 if it is not already hidden. Add another layer. What we are going to do is draw on this layer with a pencil. The pencil tool is on the toolbar on the left, 8 down from the top. This is a multi-select icon, so hold the mouse button down to fly it out and choose Pencil. Pencils, and as we will see briefly, brushes, emulate real-world drawing tools. An ordinary pencil typically does not draw a distinct line. In fact, Photoshop can emulate many different kinds of pencils. Click on the Pencil drop-down on the Pencil toolbar, and the Pencil panel opens. In the upper right-hand corner is a gear icon. Click on it and choose Small List. From that list, choose a hard round pencil and make the size about 20 pixels. Make sure the new layer is selected and just scribble on it with the pencil. As expected, the pencil only drew something when it was inside of the marching ant selections. Click on the icon next to the pencil drop-down. This brings up the brush panel. A pencil is just a brush configured to act like a pencil in the way that it paints a layer. Notice that there are quite a few types of brushes and even some brush-on figures. These are more for painterly tasks rather than technical drawings, but they are available to you if you want to use them. The only brush we are covering, though, is the hard pencil we just used. One last handy drawing tool is the paint bucket. It is located in the middle of the toolbar on the left in one of those multi-select icons. Click on it and hold it down and select the paint bucket. If need be, reset the 2-color palette back to black and white. Typically, you use a paint bucket with a selection. Create a new drawing named Bucket 1, add a layer. Then use the lasso to scribble an outline. Choose the paint bucket tool. Make sure it is set to normal mode 100% opacity. Move the bucket inside the scribbled outline and click. Now the outline is filled with black. Not a very interesting drawing in itself, but we will find this technique useful for making masks. We are going to be working with vector-based drawings and only using, as we shall soon see, bitmap tools for doing masking. Selection works differently for vector-based shapes than bitmap-based ones, so let's look at that now. Make a new drawing named Select 1. Add a layer with a green rectangle, then another layer with a blue rectangle on it that overlaps the green one. We want to select the area where the blue and green rectangles overlap and fill it with the highlight color. Now make a selection, that is, make the marching ants appear around the blue rectangle. Try using the magic wand to do this, but it doesn't work. That's because the bitmap tools don't work on a shape layer as they do on a bitmap layer. However, we know a vector shape has a path. We can use that path to make a selection. Make sure the rounded rectangle 2 layer is selected. In the Layers panel is a tab that says Paths. Click on it to show the Paths panel, which in turn shows the paths on the rounded rectangle 2 layer. If the Paths panel tab isn't showing, you can use the application menu Window Path to make it appear. At the bottom of the Paths panel is an icon that looks like a dashed circle. That uses the path that is selected in the Paths panel to create a marching ant selection. So now we have the area of the layer where the blue rounded rectangle is selected. Now click on the Layers tab, select the rounded rectangle 1 layer, that is the layer with the green rectangle on it. Then click on the Paths tab. However, don't click on the dashed circle icon. When you click on that icon, it always creates a brand new selection, which means you will lose the selection of the blue rectangle. Instead, do a right mouse click on the path entry in the Paths panel and select Make Selection. Feather radius should be 0. A non-zero feather radius is really for artistic effects. This gives us a choice on how to make the selection, and in this case we want to intersect with what is already selected, so choose Intersect with Selection, then press OK. Now you can see the ants marching around the area where the blue and green rectangles overlap. There is a gotcha about selection. It only affects the bitmap tools, not the vector tools. For example, add a new layer, and then add another vector-based rectangle that is bigger than the area the marching ants have selected. Notice how the selection didn't prevent parts of the new rectangle from being drawn. Delete the new layer. This isn't what we want. What we want to do is fill the overlapped area with our highlight color. We need a new empty layer on top of the others to add the highlight color to the intersected area. Now we can fill the selection by using the paint can. The paint can uses the little palette near the bottom of the left toolbar. We need to change the upper left swatch to the highlight color. Click on it to bring up the color picker, then fly out the swatches panel and pick the highlight color. Then close the color picker and fly out the Layers panel again. Next, use the paint can to fill the intersection area. We can turn off the selection and the rectangle layers and see that our new layer fills just the intersection. To recap, in order to use masks with shape layers, that is vector shapes, we have to use Photoshop bitmap tools. Bitmap tools act by modifying pixels on a layer, but they don't keep track of which pixels belong to a particular figure, like a rectangle. You can use the Shape tool in Pixels mode to draw bitmap-based shapes, or one of the brushes, like a hard pencil, to add paint to a layer. There are a number of tools that make selections, that is, make a boundary marked by a line of marching ants. For example, the lasso and magic wand. Pixels outside of the boundary are locked and can't be changed by any of the bitmap tools. This lets us do things like select a bitmap-based rectangle and then move or modify it independent of the pixels outside the boundary. Vector shapes are defined by a path, and that path can be used to create a selection around a vector shape.